This railroad tunnel at Rocheport, Missouri was the only one built along a 900-mile rail line connecting St. Louis, Missouri and the Texas Gulf Coast. Today, you can walk or bike there along Missouri's premier rail trail, the 240-mile-long Katy Trail State Park. But why is it here? What's so special about this one location over all that distance to warrant building a tunnel? Follow along as we investigate the geologic and historical context of the Rocheport Tunnel here on Ozark Outsider. Here at Rocheport, as the railroad comes up from the southeast, it takes a sharp bend away from the Missouri River, then heads west, crossing Montauk Creek just before tunneling through a bedrock ridge and heading northwest along a line of bluffs. Here's what the creek and ridge look like from the east. But wait, you might be wondering, why didn't the railroad just cut straight across and go around that ridge, like this? Well, to answer that question, we have to rewind through 150 years of railroad history. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, commonly known as the Katy for its initials, began construction after the Civil War. It aimed to be the first direct rail connection between the Plains and Texas, achieving that goal by the time this system map was made in 1880. The Katy's history is far too complicated for this video, but for our purposes, just note that its northern end terminated at the Mississippi River, and it didn't have its own route into either Chicago or St. Louis. By the time the Katy decided to build into St. Louis in the early 1890s, the best routes across the state had already been taken by competing railroads. So the Katy built its St. Louis extension along the north side of the Missouri River, across from a well-established Missouri Pacific route along the south side. The Missouri River flows east across the state within a broad but well-defined valley. In central Missouri, this valley becomes noticeably narrower and deeper once it starts cutting through the relatively erosion-resistant limestones and dolomites that underlie most of southern Missouri's rugged Ozark scenery. Along the river, these ancient rocks tend to form distinctive bluffs soaring 200 to 300 feet over the valley floor, giving it a canyon-like feel. At first glance, this valley seems like a great route for a railroad, providing a nearly flat water-level route to St. Louis while avoiding the more rugged terrain on either side. But it's not that simple. Today, the river has been stabilized into a permanent channel by extensive engineering work. But in the late 1800s, the Missouri River was a highly dynamic, unstable waterway, constantly eroding its banks, changing its channel, and quite capable of flooding the wide valley constrained within the massive rock bluffs on either side. So any railroad following the valley had to cling to its walls to avoid being washed away. That's what the Missouri Pacific Railroad did when it built up the south side in the mid-1800s, and that's what the Katy had to do when building down the north side in the late 1800s. Often the railroads blasted away portions of the bluffs to ensure a higher and more stable bedrock footing, trying to keep away from the river's grasp. With all that in mind, let's return to the Rocheport Tunnel and give our interpretation of the answer. The key factor is to realize that the Rocheport landscape is different than it was in the early 1890s, when the Katy was building its St. Louis extension. The Missouri River wasn't in its present channel, but was much closer to the north wall of the valley, flowing in a tight curve that intersected the bedrock ridge along Montauk Creek. Old maps and historic photographs from the early 1890s clearly show the river much closer to Rocheport than it is now. Today, a boardwalk leads out to the nose of that bedrock ridge, which is now part of Diana Bend Conservation Area. Another period photograph clearly shows the river bend right up against this ridge. Hiking a bit further out gives a comparable view from what was once the Missouri River's main channel. If the railroad had continued along the bluff line all the way to Montauk Creek, it would have projected out into that river bend. And even if it had tried to cut a sharp curve around the nose of the bedrock ridge, not ideal from an operational point of view, it would still have had to bridge the creek right along that unstable main riverbank. Rivers erode along their outer bends, so the full force of the Missouri was focused on the soft soils along this stretch. Building this close to the river, but away from the bluffs, would have been a pretty unstable location. And if the railroad had projected its grade along the riverbank instead of its actual route further inland, it would also have been far more prone to flooding, as you can assess in this photo of just a moderate flood. We've personally seen the river over the Katy's route here, even after all the modern flood control work. So the railroad seems to have decided that the best plan was just to tunnel right through the ridge, creating a smoother, straighter, and more stable route across the Montauk Creek Valley. But why didn't this happen anywhere else along the 150-mile river route? Well, no other place where a good-sized tributary broke the bluff line had the same set of circumstances. For example, where Perchy Creek comes in, the river was, and still is, on the other side of the valley, so the railroad could cut across the gap without concern. And here at the mouth of Cedar Creek, the river did, and still does, bend right up against a bluff, similar to Rocheport. Notice how the railroad once again bends inward to stay away from the river until it can reach the safety of the bluff across the tributary valley. But here, there's no intervening rock ridge blocking its path, and the creek crossing is farther from the river, making it easier to anchor a bridge. Beyond the Missouri River Valley, the railroad's route southwest took it across the gently rolling prairie terrain between western Missouri and Texas, carefully avoiding more rugged topography like the western Ouachita Mountains, and requiring no further tunnels. So it took a set of interesting and unique geologic factors to force the railroad to put a tunnel here. But that's not the whole story. Local geologic quirks affected how the tunnel itself was designed and built. For example, why is the eastern end bare rock, while the western end is dressed stone and brick? We'll answer that question and look at some other interesting local details, like fossil deposits and the actual construction of the tunnel, in a future video.